start off with.
Hi there, thanks very much for inviting me first of all. I'm not used to doing 5 minutes, so please feel free to give me a big nudge when it's time for me to stop talking. As Peter just introduced me, my name is Suzanne and I'm chair of the Campaign Against Climate Change Trade Union Group, and hopefully some of you at least will be familiar with the report that we've produced. We produced it, good, excellent, a few years ago. This is our second edition. The first edition was just straightforwardly 1 million climate jobs now, exclamation mark. The second edition, which we produced in 2009, if I remember correctly, had the byline solving the economic and the environmental crisis, solving the economic and the environmental crisis, because we thought two things. One is that there is a clear common route to both the economic crisis and the environmental crisis. When you have an economic system that is fundamentally predicated on one purpose and one purpose only, which is the pursuit of profit above all other interests, needs, etc., you certainly are in danger of producing a massive economic crisis, which we've seen, but you're also in danger of producing an environmental crisis, because it means all other concerns absolutely become second, third, fourth, fifth and last on any kind of analysis of what and how the economy should work. And the environmental crisis that we have now and the economic crisis that we have now, I think, can be located in that area. The second thing we thought was that what happened in terms of political and economic arguments was often that the two things were seen as mutually exclusive. Jobs and sustainability were seen as mutually exclusive. So if you wanted a sustainability, you couldn't have jobs, and if you wanted jobs, you couldn't have sustainability. And equally, if you wanted development more broadly, as it was called, then the idea of sustainability was just a myth that could not be employed if you wanted jobs and sustainability. I mean, it is clear as the economic crisis has developed that is an absolute myth. We are in a situation where we neither have neither have environmental sustainability, nor do we have actually any kind of prospect of real development and real opportunities for jobs in ordinary people's lives. And therefore, I think we do have to fight to expose that as a myth. I want to just move on a little bit to say that it feels to me very much that the debate at the moment is very dominated with this view that the economic crisis is something that isn't really with us, isn't really upon us at this moment in time. In reality, the environmental crisis is very much with us. No doubt the right-wing press, the Mail and the Telegraph make a field day out of weather events like the ones that we've got at this moment in time, and that's more grist to the mill that the environmental crisis isn't happening. In reality it is. And last year saw some of the most concerning developments and saw some of the most damning reports come out. For example, the International Energy Agency last year said that last year carbon output in history was at its highest point, and they identified that preventing dangerous climate change is likely to be just a nice utopia unless something is done very, very urgently about the situation. Bill from the IAE says if we do not have an international agreement whose effect is put into place by 2017, then the door to holding temperature below 2 degrees warming is closed forever. But while the world has the potential of burning, we saw the Durban talks last year, and it is clear that yet another round of international talks, it is clear that the world's great powers have absolutely no intention of making an agreement that would allow that to happen, would allow us to put in place the kind of changes that are needed to hold emissions down. And what is their priority clearly is nothing to do with reaching agreements about a sustainable economy. Their priority seems to be ensuring that we all pay the price of their economic crisis through raiding our pensions, attacking our welfare system, introducing greater and greater levels of austerity for ordinary people. I think that one of the other things that is happening most concerningly at this moment in time is that there is an attempt to skew the debate, no surprise there, but skew the debate around the question of jobs. So that whole argument that it is impossible to have sustainable jobs is becoming much more sort of dominant in the discourse in response to the crisis and in response to austerity. That somehow we will have to sacrifice sustainability such that it's happening. I mean, you know, the idea that they were actually doing anything about it in the first instance really is worthy of a huge ridicule. But they somehow position themselves as though they were desperately trying to do something about this problem, and now they can't, and they feel so terrible about it. But nevertheless, what becomes a priority is dealing with the question of austerity, dealing with the question of climate crisis, and providing jobs. And thus we see the whole terrain around the question of jobs becomes shifted, with the usual suspects leading the way, the Nigel Lawsons, etc., shifted around the idea that if we want jobs, then we're going to have to look at things like Boris Island, we're going to have to look at things like fracking, we're going to have to look at pursuing those kind of extreme energy, as it's increasingly called, those extreme energy resources. So perhaps if I can just try and conclude, how am I doing? Okay, if I can just try and conclude in this way, what were we trying to do with the Million Climate Jobs campaign? We were trying to actually position, we were, I don't know why I speak in the past tense, we are trying to position an alternative argument with lots of energy and enthusiasm about how to do that. Actually, yes, so if I just talk just very quickly what I was talking about there, you know, we've got the feed-in tariffs over solar that the government have got rid of. And actually I noticed today that there's a bunch of 100 MPs, predominantly Tory MPs, are attempting to lobby government now against the subsidies that are being provided to wind power. By the way, just for reference here, the IEA, the organisation that I spoke about earlier, identified that globally there is £250.7 billion worth of subsidies for the fossil fuel industry, which those 100 MPs just don't seem to recognise is holding up the fossil fuel industry. So what were we trying to do? 1 million climate jobs. Yes, it's about jobs. Absolutely, it's about jobs. We have some of the highest levels of youth unemployment globally at this moment in time that we've ever had historically. In Spain, we're talking 50% of young people between the ages of 16 and 24 without a job. Quite rightly, our press are talking about a lost generation. We have exactly the same thing in this country with high levels of particularly youth unemployment. But it's not just youth. Speaking as someone slightly older now, I recognise how frightening it is to see that the potential that you have to contribute to society can be written off at such a young for me age now, in your 50s and your 60s, with the skills that might actually be able to contribute to a positive society. So yes, it absolutely is about jobs. It absolutely is about challenging the demonisation of our young people. For example, when the young people took to the streets in August of this year, there was a terrible attack on those young people, that somehow they're part of a consumer culture that has got nothing, no insight, no awareness. Actually, those young people were attempting, in difficult circumstances, to vent their frustration with a society that spends its whole time demonising those people, not allowing them any hope, not allowing them any opportunities for the future, and using the opportunity of austerity to undermine any hope that they have for the decent future. So yes, it is about jobs, and it is about providing jobs, which means that young people, middle-aged people, and old people can contribute positively to the society in which they live. But it is also about the climate. 1 million climate jobs is also about the climate. We have to ensure that we are not allowing the agenda around jobs to be hijacked around a neoliberal free market agenda. The agenda around jobs, we have to bring that agenda back on the question of sustainable development. It is a myth, the idea that development and sustainability are mutually exclusive. Actually, it is capitalism and development that are mutually exclusive. That's why 1% of the population are trashing our planet. So it's about climate as well. We estimate that with 1 million climate jobs, that is jobs about reducing emissions, in the space of a short space of time, we could reduce emissions in this country by up to 80%. I'll leave you with two final things. 7% of the world's population produce 50% of CO2 emissions. 50% of the world's population produce 7% of CO2 emissions. We are serious about this prospect of fighting for 1 million climate jobs. There's a green leaflet going around. Join us this year for the 1 million climate jobs caravan as it tours the country. We look for the support of Occupy and other organisations in backing that campaign.
Thanks very much, Suzanne. Can we turn up the sound at all, or is that on maximum now? Is that better? Is that louder? 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 Okay. Yeah, the thing is that at some stage during the afternoon, the St Paul's bells are going to start ringing, unfortunately. So we're just going to have to soldier on through that. We have done events before and we can manage to get through it, and it feels really good when it stops, like banging your head against a wall. So I'll pass on now to Helena Paul. Helena Paul is a researcher with EcoNexus, which is an environmental research organisation. Thank you.
Great. The bells. Hell's bells. Anyway, as Suzanne said, the talks in Durban, clear failure, third time round. We can't rely on these guys to get us out of anything. We can only rely on them to get us into more trouble. I think that around the world we can see really clearly that people are beginning to suffer very seriously from climate change. I was asked just to mention a couple of things. I was asked to... Is that better? Okay, sorry. Around the world people really are suffering. I mean, in the Horn of Africa we've got hunger and drought. In South America we've got massively increased rainfall and droughts, fires, and we've also got mosquitoes and Rosalta diseases going up to higher levels, higher altitudes, which is very serious indeed for those people, because before you could escape from those diseases just by going up altitude-wise. Even in Europe, of course, we've seen plenty of evidence of climate instability, massive climate instability, and things like increased storms, the big winds that we had, major heat shocks in 2003, 2011. But the thing is that we mustn't lose hope because of those, because I think that there's an amazing amount that we can do, and I'll come on to some of that in a few minutes. I think that one of the issues that I've worked on for a long time, or tried to work on, it's been very, very difficult actually. You're talking about the hijacking of the economy by the corporations and the banks. And the fact is, it's quite extraordinary to me to see that Rio Plus 20, which is the next big conference, which is also going to be a complete flop and a totally ritual performance by everybody around it. But in 1992, we had some good analysis of corporations. NGOs were producing good, useful analysis and ways of implementing stuff. Now I can't find anything. You've got the group that is the corporations, business and so forth, is on equal terms with farmers, with youth, with women and all the rest of it in the discussions. The only mention in the draft on Rio Plus 20 is that corporations can help us out of the trouble that we're in. So I think we have to see that it's not just the climate debate, but the whole lot of them that are dragging us in the wrong direction. And I think that I would like to say something very briefly about two things that really bother me about the climate discussions. The World Bank, in spite of the failure, the obvious failure in Durban, is determined to continue to push for offsets. Offsets mean that countries like ours, businesses in countries like ours, can avoid reducing their emissions and continue to ask other people in the global south to reduce their emissions on the basis of what might have happened if they weren't being helped to do something different. So you see the whole thing, we continue with this corporate stuff. No reduction of emissions, but offsets. And this is something that we really ought to be much more aware of, I think, because if the World Bank is going to push this on a massive level, the next step they're going to take is to try and get it into agriculture. And whereas I think agriculture is one of the areas which we really have to think about as something that's got enormous hope for us, actually, and great hope for jobs as well, nevertheless agriculture can finally be hijacked to be the great offsetting scene where Australia, New Zealand, the US, the UK and the rest of Europe can bury their emissions and carry on as before. So I think that another thing that I wanted to mention is the issue about biofuels and biomass. I just want to mention that because I've done a lot of work on it, and it is a major problem for people in the global south. If we start trying to go from fossil fuel to biofuels, it will be at the expense of people in Africa, in Asia and in South America, and it can create such incredible devastation, devastation the like of which we've probably never seen on the face of the land. Monoculture tree plantations, failed jatropha plantations, they're already building up. We've already had corporate failures on this basis, but they intend to continue. And meanwhile, everybody who drives a car, there's probably very few of you here, I certainly don't, but you all have to add biofuels to your petrol. You've got no choice in the matter. We are being pushed in this direction whether we like it or not. We have no choice either in whether we use it or who produces it. And believe me, it really is devastating, all that. But the thing is that you are a huge hope for other people, because if we try to work cooperatively, if we try to put something together as a group of people who are working together like a body that cooperates and tries to find its healthiest possible possibilities, then I think we can make enormous changes. I work with a transition town group. People are stumbling along. They're trying to work out how to do things. They're trying to work out how to grow food. A lot of us don't have the faintest idea. We're going to make a lot of mistakes. But we need... I will round up, yes. We need to think about how we can take control of processes that are basic to us, like education, like food production. And just think of the excitement that can be involved in that. Disappointments, yes, but creativity and cooperation and so forth are going to be major issues. So let's go down that road and say we can take control of this and we can all work together, instead of going down the road of geoengineering, which is what the scientists are now proposing as an alternative to reducing emissions. And I go to quite a lot of those talks. People are totally deluded about technology. They believe that it can save us from climate change. No, we can save ourselves from climate change. We have to get on with it, that's all.
Thanks very much, Helena. Can I just ask some of the people who are standing at the back, there's lots of room here at the front, please. We're trying to put the volume up as much as we can, yeah, that's as far as it goes, unfortunately. Can you please, some of you, come in, because then that means that more people can come in at the back and actually listen to what's going on. Thank you very much. I'll now hand over to Claire Morris from the Youth Climate Alliance, who was present, I think, like some of the other members of the panel at the Durban Climate Talks in December. Claire.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, just to reiterate, everyone shuffle forwards. There's a lot of people coming in at the back, and the microphone is already as loud as it can be. Okay, basically, thanks for inviting me today. I'm here to give, hopefully, some kind of youth perspective on the whole thing. Suzanne's already mentioned wide youth unemployment. The figure that was published at the end of last year is actually 1.02 million young people unemployed, and more than that out of just the young people sector. I think over 2 million unemployment in the UK. Basically, I was in Durban with a campaign called We Have Faith, Act Now for Climate Justice, and talking about climate justice and framing that within social justice in general. We're aware that there's a huge gap widening between the rich and the poor, not only in our country but across the world, and climate change is one of the key drivers of this, as the polluters continue to drive money and resources, extracting resources, and basically we are punishing the people in parts of the world who are being most affected by severe weather, droughts, famines, as Helena mentioned, in the Horn of Africa. So I was travelling with 160 young people from Nairobi in Kenya down to the climate talks in South Africa, and we were trying to mobilise and empower local people in Africa, and it was a really moving experience because I actually saw some of these devastating impacts of climate change firsthand, and I'm done with talking to climate skeptics because that argument is over as far as I'm concerned. There's no more scope for saying that climate change isn't here, because the sea levels are rising. People from small island nations in Durban are saying, you know, that their houses are going under right now. People in Africa don't have any crops because the droughts are worse than ever, and it's really, really urgent. I know this is something that a lot of people have heard before, but this 5-year time frame is with us, and we really need to start thinking how we can involve people en masse globally, and I think the Occupy movement has real potential to drive this. I think both young people and the Occupy movement and movements such as Campaign Against Climate Change all together need to really galvanise from the grassroots and get people shouting about this. One of the campaigns that Greenpeace was driving in Durban was the slogan, "Listen to the people, not the polluters." And actually, if you look at the surveys that have been done over the last few years, about what people want, it's not being matched by even our governments who claim to be democratic. So we need to really amplify that voice as much as we can through strong campaigns. I just want to give a few more examples of some of the ways at Durban that I saw the 1% trashing the planet. One of them was that there was a lot of lobbying from oil companies, including Shell and including Eskom, which is South African, and the American conglomerate Koch Industries, and actually 6 Greenpeace activists were arrested there because they were trying to highlight this and trying to raise awareness that these meetings were going on behind the scenes and this huge lobbying was going on behind the scenes. And they produced a report called The Dirty Dozen, which showed that these networks of corporate lobbyists on behalf of the polluters were spending more than the entire GDP of nations in order to make sure that a climate legislation wasn't reached at Durban. So we're really fighting against the 1% here, and the politicians aren't in control. The people in control are people like Koch Industries, Goldman Sachs, and I think this is something we can't continue just to blame the politicians, but these corporations do need to be much more strongly regulated. Another example was the Canadian position in Durban and the fact that Canada withdrew from the only legally binding treaty, the Kyoto Protocol, and the reason for doing this was that they would be losing out massively on their own economy with the Alberta tar sands, with their very oil-driven truck industries, and they said if we continue to stay in this agreement, we're going to have to give over $14 billion in penalties, because they recognised that they had this huge ecological debt from the activity that had been going on. And this message from Greenpeace, I think, is our real strength when it comes to climate change and the way to approach it. Really to say, listen to the people and not the polluters, because those voices that are just making these things worse are the loudest because they have the most money, but actually we're the larger numbers of people, and if we can get some consolidated voice, then for democracy to continue, that has to be recognised and that has to be listened to. So I'm hoping today that whatever you take away from today, that you'll feel more empowered to be able to speak up for the things that you think need to go forwards, because if we just continue to let our democracies be lobbied and run essentially by the 1%, by the big corporations, by the polluters, we're just going to continue perpetuating the climate problem and perpetuating the food crisis and the energy crisis which are upon us. And one last thing, I know that some of you may have heard of a campaign that's coming up. It's called Move Your Money, and we recognise that the banks, Helena mentioned the World Bank, and actually the World Bank and the IMF were greatly criticised in Durban because of the way that they're handling the Green Climate Fund, which was reframed as the Greedy Corporate Fund, because the money that's meant to be going for climate adaptation for places like Africa and other countries that are suffering in the developing world, that money is actually, a lot of it's being channeled back into the very people who, back to the polluters. And one of the ways we can take this into our own hands is actually to think about where our money is and what our bank is doing with it. And the Move the Money campaign is highlighting the banks in the UK that have their hands in all of this. And if you take out your card today, and if that card says RBS or NatWest or Lloyds or HSBC or Barclays on it, you need to start thinking about what their money is going towards, because in the end they're using us, they're using your very own consumption of resources, of energy, of your money, of where you buy your food, where you buy your clothes. All of that is channeling back up to the top of those corporations, to the bankers' bonuses, to the environmental destruction. And it's time for us to take control. It's time for us to take this into our own hands and take responsibility for making sure that this money isn't directed there. It is about the flow of capital, and we need to make sure that it flows away from those really destructive things back into our own communities, back into where things should be in our local communities and in our own lives. Because so yeah. Okay, sure. So thanks, and please consider your role and your own networks and environments and what you can do to step up on that. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Claire. There is a website called moveyourmoney.org. I recommend to everybody go and have a look at that. Shara Ali.
Great, thanks. Is that okay? Can you hear me? Hi. Testing? Okay, great. Well, thanks very much for the invitation, and I'm here on behalf of the Green Party. I'm not exactly sure what I have to teach you, that's for sure, particularly with the panellists up here, but I'm going to offer some potentially sentimentalist reflections on what our common potential fate is today in the 21st century, and it's quite a tall order for sure. I mean, many of us can get accused perhaps of being alarmist, but actually I suspect our aspiration is objectivity, and that is alarming, not to be confused with alarmist. So I want to draw attention to one of the main problems in the global context, and that's the exportation of the American dream. And I'm going to start, ironically, with a cracking film, and you can admit if you do watch the subprime Hollywood offerings from time to time. There's a film, American Dream, which came out some years ago, and there's a beautiful scene in that actually where a young boy, a young hero, is taking a little bit of video of a plastic bag flying and meandering in the wind, and he says to his companion, "Sometimes there's so much beauty in the world, I just can't take it." Which is something that I feel on a regular basis, even when I'm not behind my camera actually, and I suspect you do too, which is why you're here. And let me say at the outset, so I don't neglect to mention this, that the Green Party is 100% in solidarity with your action here. 100%. We actually are the only party political point to be made here, who are campaigning for the abolition of the Corporation of London, a completely unelected, undemocratic, untransparent body who don't even know how they operate, except when we find out that they're squandering our money, and they're making money, they're printing money, and they're getting away with it. And so make no mistake, your physical presence here is not just symbolic, but it's literally extremely important, and let it grow and continue long into the future, but let it find its destiny as soon as possible. So, coming back to American Beauty and the abolition of the Corporation of London. Silence. Beautiful silence. We're screwing up the planet big time. We need to get where we need to get, further and faster. But why isn't it working? Why is it that when I want to go and march for climate action, all I can see is people around me shopping like there's no tomorrow? On Oxford Street, hundreds and thousands of people. Boxing Day, hundreds of thousands of people shopping like there's no tomorrow. So what is that about deep in the human psyche that is causing us not to actually see the problem that we're faced with, in spite of all the objective science that we have conditioned and properly internalized? It's the power of denial. It's the power of the American dream to try and sell us stuff that doesn't make us happier, to such an extent that Selfridges, for example, can be parading and emblazoning posters which are boasting about the fact that you want it, you need it, but you don't need it, that you shop, therefore you are. But that is a nonsense. Even if you look at respected psychological surveys about the UK population, one of the main findings is that the more you earn, the more you think you can't afford what you really need. That's you yourself, not you in this tent, of course, but the 99% who are admitting that the more they earn, the more they can't afford what they think they really need. It can't be because they don't have more stuff. It's because they're generating more and more desires according to the American dream. But these desires are hugely and totally unsustainable, and as are the international so-called summits. Why was I being asked in October 2009 about my hopes for Copenhagen? Forget about 3 months' time, Copenhagen, December 2009. What about right now? What about the day before yesterday? Our time is now. It is a completely urgent situation we're facing here. We can't rely upon summits where people outside those summits are literally suffering and dying and begging for water around those summits when we have those summits in Africa. It's an absolute irony, and we're here. How do we overcome and gain our mission? So finally, what is our mission? Our mission is the kind of resilience which challenges, for sure, the corporate system, which challenges the banks. It's the kind of resilience and the inspiration which resulted in, I don't know whether any of you hail from Brixton, that's the Brixton pound note I'm holding there, quite a tatty one because I'm always parading it in this way, but the Brixton pound note is an example of a transition town movement who are taking the fight in their own hands. They are showing that they can actually, through personal empowerment and community, can actually find the ways, getting back to roots, getting back to the beauty of our earth and our planet, and finding out ways that they can lead properly meaningful lives. So what ultimately is our difficulty? Here is these things just come at you when you look at the world. Here is an actual, let me hold that up there. Here is a piece of origami which I picked up on the tube on the way here. Somebody left it there, probably as a lucky charm. So I picked it up, and this is our good luck here. That could have been obviously sat on, were it not for the fact that we look around our environment and see things that are there waiting to be seen. So what is actually our ultimate predicament here? What is it that's failing to give us the motivation that we need? Well, I put it to you that ultimately the problem is that there's so much beauty in the world that we just can't help taking it for granted. And that is a crime. And we can and we must stop taking beauty for granted, and that will give us all the motivation we need to save this beautiful planet of ours.
Thank you very much, Shara. Just a reminder, this event is entitled How the Global 1% are Trashing the Planet and Stealing Your Future. Hand over now to George Monbiot.
Thanks very much, Peter. Can everyone hear me on this? How's that? Is that better? Okay. Yes? Alright, well, I'll do my best. Thanks for giving me the chance to do something I've never done before, which is to give a talk in my coat and my socks. It's always nice to have something new. The fundamental problem with climate change is that it's not just about what we do, it's also about what we don't do. And in fact, what we don't do tends to be rather more important in terms of dealing with climate change than what we do. And this is a problem for several reasons. First, because it offends the sense of agency. And that's perhaps an even more fundamental myth of humanity than the American dream is, that we are powerful beings and that we can change things by continually amplifying our presence on Earth, that we can constantly do things bigger and better and flashier, and that will solve everything. And of course what climate change says is that we've got to do less of many things, and that we've got to do things more quietly than before. And it offends a very fundamental thing in the human psyche, which is that great sense of human egotism, that actually we are a very big, very loud species, and that our virtues lie in being very big and very loud. But in the more immediate sense, it creates a political problem, which is as follows, that it's not so much about the new technologies you get into, or the new businesses you might stimulate, it's about the old ones you get out of. And the key task, as far as climate change is concerned, is getting out of fossil fuels. It's not getting into wind, it's not getting into solar, it's not getting into nuclear or any of the other low carbon options. It is, to some extent, of course, getting into energy efficiency and lower use and the rest of it, but the fundamental task behind that is to get out of oil, gas, coal, tar sands, other unconventionals, to get out of the fossil fuels which are the main driver of climate change. And that's when you run into your political difficulty. And at the moment, governments have tried to square that difficulty, both the last government and the current one, by pretending that it doesn't really exist, by pretending that there is not a conflict between the aims of climate change and the aims of the weight. No, I'm not going to wait there. Okay, 30 minutes. Okay. All right. Okay, I'll keep going then. Too much amplification. Too much noise. This is the human presence asserting itself in a rather old-fashioned kind of way. Okay. All right. So they're trying to pretend that you can have it all. That you can have the new technologies, you can have the low-carbon economy, and you don't have to close down the oil industry, the gas industry, the coal industry. And so what we've seen is the perpetual granting of new licenses and even tax holidays and royalty holidays for companies exploiting the North Sea and exploiting the area to the west of the Shetlands, for instance, in the UK, and similar things taking place all over the world. In fact, the only country on earth which has, apart from Ecuador, which has systematically tried to cut down the size of its fossil fuel industry has been Saudi Arabia. And it has tried to do so purely in order to keep the price of oil high, that it will turn the tap down to push the price up. Everybody else is trying to maximise the supply of fossil fuels, while in many cases claiming that they're trying to minimise the consumption of fossil fuels. And of course, the two aims cannot be reconciled. And it's a testament to the state of play where we've achieved very little with climate change, that there has been no reduction whatsoever in the scale of the fossil fuel industry since 1992. Far from it. It has expanded even while governments tell us that they're doing everything possible to limit climate change. And the key task of those who wish to prevent action is to distract us from the fact that it has to be a reduction in fossil fuels that we are aiming for, regardless of what we go into, regardless of all the other things we do and do not do. The key task is to prevent the current levels of extraction of fossil fuel. And because it's a key task, it's the one thing which is excluded from political debate. The idea of leaving it in the ground, which is the only safe kind of geoengineering, the only safe kind of carbon capture and storage, which has proven itself over hundreds of millions of years as being a very effective way of securing carbon capture and storage. That is the only way in which we can crack this problem, by leaving fossil fuels in the ground. But of course, a vast political infrastructure now exists, A, to distract us from that, and B, to oppose any measure which might indirectly lead to even a barrel of oil being left in the ground, or a ton of coal being left in the ground, or a cubic metre of gas being left in the ground, which would not otherwise have been left in the ground. Excuse me. So, going back into the 1990s, you see this campaign against doing anything on climate change kicked off initially as pure astroturf. Does everybody in the audience know what astroturf means? If you don't, stick your hand up. Okay, astroturf is creating a fake grassroots movement. An astroturf movement is one which looks like a grassroots movement, sounds like a grassroots movement, constantly says it is a grassroots movement, but isn't a grassroots movement. And in fact, the best way to spot an AstroTurf movement is it constantly says, we are a grassroots movement. If you're a grassroots movement like us, you don't have to keep going around saying we are a grassroots movement. Now, one of the supreme ironies, which even in a place like this shakes your faith in atheism, is that AstroTurf TM is a product belonging to the Monsanto Corporation, which happens to be one of the most effective astroturfing outfits in world history. Anyway, it started off with a campaign initially run, believe it or not, by a tobacco company, Philip Morris. And Philip Morris wanted to prevent any regulatory action on passive smoking in the United States. But it couldn't be seen to be doing this purely as a pro-smoking campaign, because everyone would, to pardon the pun, smoke them out immediately. So it had to create a smokescreen. And the way of doing this was to commission its public relations consultants, a company called APCO, not to be confused with ACPO, which is an entirely different problem which we confront in this country, but a public relations concern called APCO, to set up a so-called grassroots coalition called the Advancement for Sound Science Coalition, entirely fronted by public relations people but pretending to be a grassroots movement. But as I say, it couldn't campaign only on cigarette smoke, saying government should get out of the way and stop regulating cigarettes and all the rest of it. It had to add a load of other issues to the list, such as biotechnology, nuclear, and of course global warming. And it said, governments are trying to regulate our poor oppressed companies in order to impose their New World Order, eco-fascist, communist, Nazi ideology on everybody else, and therefore it has to be stopped, and we exist as a coalition to stop that, as well as to stop this infernal regulation of cigarettes and the rest of it. And then it was that coalition, which was initially funded by Exxon and various other oil companies, who picked it up from Philip Morris and took up that baton and ran with it and thought this is a very effective vehicle for us to use. And then since then, it's gone to various other astroturfing groups, but it has now migrated, first of all, into the corporate-funded think tanks. People like the Taxpayers Alliance and the Global Warming Policy Foundation here in this country, both of whom flatly refuse to say who is funding them, but have budgets amounting to the millions, and it's not coming from little old ladies sending in £1.30 in donations. And then on the other side of the Atlantic, the American Enterprise Institute, the Cato Institute, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, Hudson Foundation, all the rest of it, who are basically also AstroTurf operations, in that they purport to be objective academic think tanks, but they are purely PR outlets, lobbyists for big corporations. And so you have that there, and then coming close behind them, you have the people you could call the political entrepreneurs, who aren't, as far as we know, being funded by the oil companies, but have seen a great opportunity to make a lot of money and get a high profile. People like Lord Monckton, Ian Plimer, Christopher Booker, people like this, who have created a real industry on the coattails of this. Now, Claire said, let's not talk to these people anymore, and I agree, let's not talk to them. But we've got to remember they will keep talking at us, and they will keep trying to steer the debate, fundamentally on behalf of the 1%, on behalf of the fossil fuel corporations. And Orwell said that in times of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. And one of our key aims, as anyone who's concerned about climate change, is constantly to remind people of the truth. The fundamental scientific facts of climate change and the implications, both in terms of what that will do to the planet and its people, but also in terms of what we need to do in the way of political responses. And so simply getting out there and reminding people of the facts of the case, irrespective of what the Daily Mail says, irrespective of what the Telegraph says, irrespective of what the think tanks say, irrespective of what the fossil fuel companies say, that, ladies and gentlemen, is a radical act, and one of the key things that we as campaigners need continually to engage in and to address. Thank you.
Right, thanks very much, George. It's quite difficult conditions here with all this noise. You might be getting a bit cold as well, so give your toes a little bit of a wriggle here. People at the front are taking your shoes and boots off. We've also we've provided for you, ladies and gentlemen, some refreshments. We're going to start handing those out now. Help you keep warm. So I've got a couple more speakers now. So as I said, Raymond, Friends of the Earth is international climate campaigner for Friends of the Earth, is now going to say a few words.
Thank you. Can you hear me at the back? Usually I never have a problem with my voice. Even louder.
Just need to be a tiny bit more into the microphone.
More into the microphone. Okay, I'm more into the microphone then. First of all, I want to thank you for inviting me to come and speak here. And it's always a great problem when you're on the platform with such brilliant speakers. They tend to cover up most of the things that you want to talk about. And but first of all, I thought maybe, people keep mentioning here Durban and the climate talks. If you bear with me, I thought I'd just quickly actually say how big a disaster Durban was, and actually what was agreed there and what its implications are before moving on to what do we need to do. You know, sometimes you're at the climate negotiations, and I have to say, at the climate negotiations, the one thing I always think is never negotiated is the climate. But what you see in the climate negotiations is fundamentally negotiations about economy, about power, and ultimately about who has the right to live and who will die, who will have food and who won't, who will be forced migrants and who won't. And it fundamentally is about keeping the power of the 1% against the rest of the globe. Now, at the end of that Durban talks, I saw Chris Huhne speaking, saying how great and the outcome of Durban was, that we were back again now with more ambition and the world was starting to take action. But we were one of, as Friends of the Earth, one of the very few NGOs that were completely critical of the Durban outcome, of the idea that what we needed was more negotiations about another new treaty to start in 2050, to be negotiated by 2015, and not to come into operation till 2020. So 8 years of inaction, when we know that the window of action is rapidly diminishing. And a treaty that at its core is going to do one major thing. It's going to attack the fundamental principle of equity and historical responsibility. The idea that those who cause the problem have responsibility to take action and to help the poorer and developing countries to be able to not only deal with the impacts of climate change, but to be able to develop cleanly and in a sustainable way. And that fundamentally was why the European Union and why the United States and other rich developed countries were so keen on having a new global treaty, because they want to unravel that as its key issue.
Piece of paper to send around.
Some people said, well, at least we saved the Kyoto Protocol in Durban. Actually, we have not even ratified the second commitment period of Kyoto. That was left maybe to Doha in Qatar at the end of this year. But what we have seen is Russia, Canada and Japan saying that they won't even put their emission reductions and sign up to the second commitment period. We've seen Australia and New Zealand saying, hold on, we have to think about this depending on our national circumstances. And we have the European Union that said, yes, we will commit to the second commitment period of Kyoto, but at the moment only with a 20% emissions reductions. Those of you who might follow a little bit of climate might know that we've already reached 20% emissions reductions, at the European level without taking any action, without